Thank you very much, Sean, for having me at this great seminar. Um, thank you for that introduction. So I hope my slides are ready. So I'm going to present on a very important topic of disability inclusive education and development. And this is a topic which I've recently been doing some work on, both as part of the inclusive education policy that we've developed together with the site savers, as well as with the Ministry of Education's new radical inclusion. So it's a privilege to be able to present some of these materials in this seminar. So the topic is disability inclusive education and development. And as you've given those detailed introduction, so I work mainly, my background is mechanical manufacturing engineering. I've been doing a lot of work around disability rights advocacy and using my background to develop technologies. So perhaps we can move to the next slide, please. So I'm going to be looking at, it's a very short presentation, I hope. So we're going to be looking at disability inclusive development as an overview. And then, I mean, what are some of the barriers that sort of prevents inclusive development generally? And I'm going to use context in Sierra Leone. I'm going to use the examples that I've worked in Sierra Leone. And also, I think the most important one is about looking at the strategies for inclusive development. There are a few examples there on the fair selection and equity, equality and systemic change that I'm going to use some Sierra Leonean examples as well. And then I'm going to conclude with disability inclusive education, which is like an application of what we've been doing at the Dorothy Springer Trust, using my story as well as how that impacts Dorothy Springer Trust and how we've changed and transformed the lives of so many people in Sierra Leone. Next slide, please. So I'm sure people are aware and knowledgeable about most of these things, given the nature of this seminar. But I think disability inclusive development is about a new paradigm shift. And that is to say, before the onset of the UNCPRD, that's the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, people with disability were seen as just the charity cases. And there was a lot of lobbying in the UN, and that brought about a clear definition of disability, that disability is no longer seen as a curse in an African context. If you're disabled, you're seen as a curse. So we have people with autistic tendencies that people think these are devil children, they're bewitched. And so they're taken out to the woods and left there for animals to devour them. And so these are the thinkings that we used to happen in places in Africa, and many other people used to think about disability as charity. And of course, the UN CPRD came along and said, no, persons with disabilities are those with long-term physical, mental, intellectual, and sensory impairments, which actually links these impairments with the environment. And so this is the paradigm shift, that disability is no longer about the person only, it's about the environment. So the environment impairs, or the barriers impairs that person with disability, that prevent them from having a full participation in society. And so, of course, if you look at it from an inclusive development point of view, we in Sierra Leone have been facing a lot of exclusion, if I can put it that way. I mean, of course, this climate is changing a little bit, but a lot of people in Sierra Leone have been facing exclusion from the point of view of gender, ethnicity, age, but particularly disability. You know, some of the studies we did in Sierra Leone was looking at 46% of women don't have access to education. 39 of men do have access to education. So the statistics are pretty dire in terms of giving disabled people access to society in our context here. And so really, it's a big thing here in this country. And so if we try to apply the inclusive development process, it's about ensuring that this marginalization and exclusion is stopped, basically, to allow disabled people to become equal partners in development. Far too often, people with disabilities are looked at as, what decision can these people make? And I've got some very telling examples later on when I looked at the 4 stages, the 4 strategies of inclusion in inclusive development. So perhaps we can go to the next slide. So this is about the definition and the inclusive development paradigm shifts. So just to put it in context, in terms of inclusion, but from the point of view of development, again, using the UNCPRD as our Bible globally, but also specifically in Sierra Leone, we have the Disability Act, upon which it was derived from the UNCPRD, which was domesticated and led to the Sierra Leone Disability Act of 2011. I think to me, I'll see inclusion, especially in terms of development, as a science, because it's a process. It's a process that ensures that we change and we have a systemic reform and in bringing about a change of mind, a change of approach, a change of structures. And in the context of education, it's about how do we remove some of these barriers that ensure that people with disability have equal access to education, to employment, to health services, and all of this. So I think it has to ensure that we become more participatory in the process. And of course, the Sustainable Development Goals makes it very good for us, because now, the Millennium Development Goals did not talk about disability specifically. Unlike now, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, which really makes it so concrete that you cannot leave no one behind. And that's the mantra that we use here. So, putting inclusion and inclusive development in the context of legal and legal instruments globally, I think you will see that this definition is pretty apt. So next slide, please. So I'm going to look at, we talked about some of the barriers that disability, what makes somebody disabled is really the barrier. And so,
Sorry, if I may take a second here, sorry to interrupt. Please, can I remind all participants that you must have your cameras and microphones muted so that we don't have interference while our speakers are presenting. This would be very much appreciated. So please do take a moment to check your microphones and cameras for us. Thank you very much indeed. Sorry, Dr. Dunbuya, back to you.
Thank you very much. So I mentioned earlier about the link between disability and what actually makes somebody disabled is the impairment, the barriers. So I'm looking at 5 barriers here, and this is a very powerful slide, and there's so much in it. So given time, I'm not going to delve into too much detail here, but I'm going to look at these 5 barriers. I mean, it's done in a form of a target. And I think to some extent, this is deliberate from the point of view that, the target here is an institution. And I think these institutional barriers is where we have to ensure that we overcome these barriers to ensure that people with disabilities have an equal participation in life and society. So for example, in Sierra Leone, we have a situation where, we have we have disabled people organizations, what's now called organizations of persons with disabilities. We have institutions like the Cheshire Home and Blind School, and these institutions receive subvention from government, especially the institutions. And when this subvention is basically amount of money that's given to these institutions to run the institutions, both for the disabled children, in their boarding homes, in the schooling, and all of that. And so there is an issue around political will. And so if you have the strong political will, then these institutions are not left to languish to some extent. And so so the point here really on the institutions that I want to just focus on briefly is about the political will. And it was the political will that led to the domestication of the UNCPRD into our Disability Act. And that has led to people making sure that disabled people are now considered. So we have, for example, the midterm development goals, the midterm development plan of the Sierra Leone government, which for the first time has included disability issues around developmental strides as part of the government development department. And so that this is truly political will. However, as I mentioned earlier, there is the issue about supporting special needs institutions, which are a real challenge. Then you look at the attitude. It's very interesting because we did a study recently with Irish Aid, which is looking at what are people's attitudes towards persons with disabilities. And what we did was actually take two disabled people, we put them in front of the camera, and then people came around and wrote all sorts of negative things. I mean, we didn't tell them write negative things. It was just what their perception of persons with disabilities. So people will come in and write this: disabled people are stupid, they're troublemakers, they're rude. So they will write all of these things on the body of the person standing in front of the camera. And then suddenly you will see that person put on their jacket, and the next cut, you will see them either presenting the national news, or you will see them in court defending a case. And this was trying to make sure that people have negative attitudes, negative perceptions towards persons with disability, but the reality is not the case. And so, I mean, when we play this out, and you will see the change and the amazement in people's faces that, oh, so disabled people are really intelligent. They can actually defend. Some of them are actually lawyers. Some of them are journalists. So, it's how do you change this negative perception is what we've been trying to do. Of course, there's the environmental barriers. There's one thing in Sierra Leone where we have a lot of these disability laws, but they're not implemented. So you have people building roads, and the next thing you know, you have all these hawkers selling on the roadside. So you have somebody with a wheelchair that is not going to be able to climb to go up that ramp because there's a table that's been built on that ramp. So it defeats the objective. Of course, communication is another barrier. And here is where we talk mainly about, how do we make communication accessible? We have an educational system which still does not have Braille materials. People with visual impairment do not have Braille materials. People with hearing impairment, they get involved in legal matters, and there are no people there to defend them. Although we've done a lot of advocacy to now have the police to at least have somebody interpreting in the police force. So this is a great thing that's happening even in this seminar. Of course, the financial aspect is an example I normally use. We talk a lot in development about access to finance, microfinance, and all of that. I imagine how many persons with disability will go in front of their bank manager and say, loan me the equivalent of $2,000 to go and start up a business. And the first thing that comes up to that bank manager's mind is, oh my goodness, how are you going to pay that money? So access to finance is a real challenge. So as I said, there's a lot of deep issues around this, but because of time, I've just given some few examples, local examples. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So how we remove some of these barriers, and what are the strategies in terms of inclusive development? Well, one of the things that we need to do is inclusive participation. I mentioned earlier the Sustainable Development Goals talks about leaving no one behind. In the past, we have a mantra here that says, nothing for us without us. You have to get us included. And I have to say, this was really encouraging when the midterm development goals, midterm development plan by the government of Sierra Leone was being developed. We remember staff of the Ministry of Planning and Development came to our office and they discussed with us. And we said, you have to make disability as a standalone cluster. And I have to say, cut a long story short, where now we have a standalone cluster, although it's grouped with women and girls and children or people with disability. But that's a huge achievement, making sure that in a national development plan that the multi-donors look at has issues on disability around there. Of course, the other thing we need to consider in removing these barriers is non-discrimination. And I think that's self-explanatory, really. And that is making sure that, you know, we don't discriminate against persons with disability. I've been involved in some job creation opportunities, and we go and tell government and employers and said, you know, do you know in the Disability Act, there's a 15% discount for employing somebody with disability? But that's not the reason why you need to employ that person. You employ them because of their abilities and what they can offer to the company. So, but many times this is disregarded, and sadly to say. But to be able to remove some of those barriers that I talked about earlier, we need to be able to be non-discriminatory. Of course, comprehensive accessibility and universal design. One of the things I mentioned in my advocacy work here, I did a lot of advocacy work in the UK in Bracknell. In fact, when I was working in the accessibility unit as part of the ITS in the Department for Transport in London, I used to travel regularly to London. And suddenly I imagine going up these stairs on the platform, getting to the other platform to go down to London, then coming back, going up the stairs. And it dawned on me one day, I walked into this newspaper house and I said, you know what, we need to do something about this. So we did an article, and suddenly Bracknell Council took this on and they renovated the train station. What happened next is what I always say to people here, because when you talk about accessibility, oh, it's expensive making my building accessible and all of that. And I say to them that once that station had been made accessible by putting lifts in and all of that, it wasn't just me benefiting from that level of accessibility. It was now pregnant women, older people, carrying heavy luggages and all of that, that have now benefiting from that station being accessible. So I think accessibility issues are not just for persons with disability or disability issues. It's about societal benefits. And that's where I'm going to pause for that. The final one is autonomy and self-determination. I think many times people like to make decisions for us. As in our African culture, you have a daughter, you say, oh, that daughter is not going to go to school, she's going to get married and all of that. You have a boy and say, that's going to be my doctor. No, I think for persons with disability, let us be self-determined and decide for ourselves. We know what we want, and we need to be given the opportunity to do that. And I think above all of this, it's about making sure that we approach a twin track approach in Sierra Leone, particularly because we have a situation in Sierra Leone at the moment where people are saying, well, we have to go full mainstream. The other paradigm is that, no, we don't have to we have to maintain special needs schools. The other one say, no, well, we need to close special needs schools. And I think the important thing is making sure that we have a twin track approach. We can, for example, in Cheshire home, we have children who are schooled with non-disabled children in the home. And then later on, our disabled children go to external schools, and making sure that they're mainstream in that action. On the other hand, you have schools like the school for the hearing impaired or the blind school, where you have children are learning specifically on their own with their peers and not with non-disabled children. And again, I mean, those two systems work, because if you want to do an analysis of that, one thing you have to say is, well, really, if you go and put somebody who's blind without learning Braille, they're not going to be very good performers in the mainstream. So you have to get special needs schools. So next slide, please. I think I'm just wrapping up towards my few slides. And so this is what it is in terms of inclusive development. And this slide for me is very, very important. It's a selection process. And how fair is the selection process? So you have a bird there, a monkey, a dolphin, an elephant, and a fish, you know, all of those, and are there to ask for fair selection. So take an exam. What do you want to do? Well, climb the tree. So is this fair? Or is it fair or is it equitable? And so I want to pause. I want to leave that question with the audience just to hold that thought. But It's really, how do we create the environment to be both equitable, but also equal? So we go to the next slide as another example of this equity and equitable equality. So we have a situation here of three pictures, you know, all three boys or three people. One is short, the other one is shorter than the other, and the other is taller. So they're all standing on an equal box. So we assume equality, right? And because they're all treated equal. But one of them cannot see what's going on the other side of the fence. So it is not equitable, right? And so what do? How do we change these barriers? Well, we do that by making sure that we provide two boxes for the shorter person. Now they can see what's going on over the fence. But most importantly, and the systemic change that needs to happen is just remove the fence. That way everybody is equal and equitable, right? So, and I think this is what we need to do for full participation of persons with disability in society. Final slide, final two slides on my application, please. So I've not put this slide just to, I mean, it gives a bit of background about me, but the reason why I've put this slide is applying all of those things I've been talking about in real life through Dorothy Springer Trust. You know, I grew up, as you said in your introduction, in a home where, you know, we're all disabled people, and we got on, we all did our different things. And I happened to be lucky to go to the UK and got sponsorship from this lady, Dorothy Springer Trust, on the right picture. And as a result of that, I took the best qualification that I could. And then worked in the UK, spent some time there. And then I came visiting in 2005 and saw somebody that was growing up in the Cheshire and begging on the streets. And it occurred to me how that could have been me had I not been given this opportunity that I had. So I went back very troubled about what I experienced. And I decided that I have to do something about it. So cut a long story short, I packed up my job in the UK, I came back to Sierra Leone and started a charity which was registered in the UK in 2008 called the Dorothy Springer Trust. And to date, we've been developing and supporting persons with disabilities and changing lives as a way of me giving something back, but to make sure that these guys have equal opportunity in education and in development. So I think the point here is making sure that we have as many change agents that we can to be able to make sure that these things are fair. And I think if I'm not mistaken, I'm going to my last slide. And this is what the Dorothy Springer Trust does. So we've trained over 100 persons with disabilities, 75%, which is an incredible number of persons with disabilities in employment, paying their taxes, contributing to national development. And we train all persons with disability, from people who suffered from polio, like myself, to people with visual impairment, to people with learning disability, to visually impaired people. And we set the record in getting disabled people. And what we do specifically, we train in IT because we believe IT provides a level playing field. And we work with people with disability to get them jobs through our advocacy, through our employment bureau. And we pioneer the first intake of disabled people into the Sierra Leone police force. As you can see, these guys doing. They're in the telecommunication department, the police force, and some of them are getting, because of their IT skills, are beginning to get into cyber crimes and all of that. And this is what IT provides. And there's been a lot of research that shows that people with disability taking part in IT provides a huge opportunity for them to succeed in life. Next slide, please. And I think that's where I'll conclude, if I've not gone over my time so significantly. Thank you very much for listening to me. This is my presentation.
Wow, goodness. So first of all, and I know this is going to be a bit of a difficult one for our interpreters because I'm going to talk in our language, Creole. I tell God thank you for you, Dr. Abs. I'm glad the way you can be sweet. And if any salon people and then I una for listening good, make we help change we country. Yeah, we get for a try. Okay, so for those of you that don't talk Creole, I'm not very religious, but I do thank God for people like Dr. Doumbouya who are making effective change in Sierra Leone. And if there are any Sierra Leoneans here today, please be inspired by what you've heard so that we can go forward and create positive change in our country. Thank you. So there was so much that you said there. I think I will actually do a brief recap before we go over to the discussion. After we have heard from Nina Asterina, who is joining us today at around 8 o'clock in the morning in Indonesia, where she works as Program Manager for Urban Inclusivity Initiatives with Indonesia's Kota Kita Foundation. She's worked in over 10 cities, researching expertise in urban and policy issues. She focuses on researching, developing, and implementing initiatives. So I have an idea of what she's going to talk about because I've had the privilege of seeing her presentation, and I know that you will be just as inspired by her as you were from my brother, Dr. Dumbuya. So with no further ado, Sister Nina Asterina, I hand over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Sari. Yeah, I'll be waiting for again to share the screens. Okay. Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm Nina Astrina. I'm a program manager in Kota Kita Foundation. So Kota Kita Foundation, I'm going to talk about the inclusive development starts from inclusive perspective. And then next slide is my organization's background. Next slide, please. So Kota Kita is a non-profit organization based in Indonesia, city of Solo, with expertise in urban planning and citizen participations in the design and development of the cities. So Kota Kita's project focuses on governance, inclusivity, and climate change resilience. We are working more in 16 cities in Indonesia to do developing and then implementing our visions to build a city for all. And next slide, please. So in this event, I want to share our experiences in inclusive development. So inclusive development highlight the recognitions of universal human rights where no one left behind in many aspects, including economic, social, cultural, and political life. So what really matters in the inclusive development, like Kota Kita in our works, we define that inclusive development is everyone matters. So we're starting from the persons with disabilities. It also include elderly and then those who are working in the informal sectors, young people, women, children, and then academicians and practitioners, also government and related stakeholders. So in inclusive development, we are highlighting, I'm sorry, thank you for the interpreter. So yeah, I'm going to repeat. In the inclusive development, who really matters. It was for everyone because persons with disabilities, elderly, and then those who are working in the informal sectors, young people, women, children, academicians, and practitioners, also government and related stakeholders need to collaborate together to make a city for all. So we don't discriminate each person's values or identity, regardless their age, regardless their conditions and everything. We inspire them to do collaborations together to making a better city for all. And the next slide, please. So first, we have to understand and how and why some are left behind. In the inclusive development, we should consider at least 5 aspects. And then the first one is discriminations of exclusions. In this case, like some people faces discrimination regarding their identity, including but not to limited to gender, ethnicity, age. Yeah.
I'm so sorry to be so rude and interrupt you. But I would like to ask if it's possible to slow down a little bit so that the interpreters are able to translate for us. Is that possible, please?
Yeah,
We're
sure.
very keen to have your presentation, so please forgive me, but
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sharon. I'm sorry if I'm speaking too fast, but I'm trying to be slower. So yeah, in understanding and how and why some are left behind, the first aspect we need to consider is the discriminations. In here, regarding the identity of one person's, It's not limited to gender, ethnicity, age, class, disability, sexual orientation, religion, nationality, or indigenous status. We all should consider this aspect to be building a more inclusive development, and those vulnerable face discrimination to some extent that prohibit them to get to the meaningful participations in the development stages. And then the second one is the geographical aspect. So for those who living in the same isolated areas and then get very limited access to the physical services or social services, it will make them hard to get advantage from the development planning and the implementations of the programs from the government. And then the third one is the socio-economic status. So it was related in terms of income and then wealth and educational attainment and then access to the employment. So those who are vulnerable, having difficulties in accessing the socio and economic facilities to improve their life. And then the fourth one is the governance. So in the governance aspect, the commitment and then the political will from the global, national, or local institutions will really matter in determining the policy and then the programs for those people living in the vulnerable aspects. So the government who are ineffective, unjust, exclusive, and then corrupt or unaccountable and then unresponsive will put some people to the disadvantage, and then they will be left behind in the process. So their voices haven't been included in the policymaking decisions. And then the fifth aspect that we need to consider is shocks and fragility and vulnerability and exposures to the effects of climate change and natural hazards, violence or conflicts, emergencies, and then economic downturns like right now in the COVID situation. It might put some in a more vulnerable situation, which hinder them from accessing the social services in the cities. From the pictures we can see, it's one of the examples of the flood that happening in one city of Indonesia, which makes disabled persons having difficulties in accessing the daily life during this moment. So it was quite hard for them to get involved in the process. And the next slide, please. So yeah, taking Indonesian case study, Kotekita's research defining barriers to more meaningful participations. And then the first one is policy language is not translated into operational words on the ground. What does it really mean? Because in Indonesia, in the national policy, we determine several differs of disabilities type, but then in the local implementations, the local government and practitioners find it really hard to have the same meaning of diverse disabilities. That's why like almost of the policy haven't been targeted to those people, and they put it into more disadvantaged situations. And then the second one is no segregated data of disability with figures varying across official agencies. So in Indonesia, it depends on the Department of like education, social affairs, or health. It will depend on the definitions of disabilities, and then there is no universal data, which makes more people of disabilities haven't been identified and documented in those departments, and it makes them hard to access the services. And then the third one is the social stigma, which remains a key obstacle to inclusive development. Like Dr. Abs shared to us that some people of disabilities having stigmatized by not having a good skill or a good intellectual to be engaged more in the participations in the social life. And then the fourth one is the persons with disabilities do not have a strong voice nor participate fully in the civic life. Because those stigmatizations before hinders them to be limited in the social aspects of people. And then is also included in the political, events that makes them having a very low represented in voicing their thoughts and ideas and even aspirations. That's why like a lot of policy and programs which resulted not based on the evidence-based policies. So it makes those people still be left behind in the development process. And then the two left is about connectivity and accessibility. The connectivity of accessible public, like in the pictures, is like fragmented and piecemeal. So most cities in Indonesia focusing more in the visualizations of the universal design rather than really connecting those people of disabilities from point to point to get the services. So instead, they are focusing more, like on the visualizations of the programs rather than truly benefiting them. And then the last one is the implementation of accessibility, kind of like fall short of universal design standards. So somehow like the constructions of fall behind of the planning because they kind of like don't understand what truly means by universal designs. For example, they kind of thinking the patterns of the guiding block as only for accessories of the streets. So it doesn't have meaning for the constructions persons. It was really saddening situations because eventually all the process from the planning, even though they are including those persons with disabilities, and then at the end, it wasn't reflecting their needs and then aspirations. Next slide, please. So this is kind of the example where the multi-stakeholder coordinations, connectivity, universal design standard is worsening by the limited public awareness on the disability and the needs and aspirations. In these pictures, you can see all the guiding blocks are, like hitting the trees, or the ramp is too steep. And then there is also like a straight, mechanical vendors putting their tools and equipments on the road. So all the good initiative from the government, not really, reflecting the needs and aspirations. And this is, even though the progress in the cities is going towards the inclusive effort, it needs more than that to be implemented in a good way and then benefiting all these people. Next slide, please. And then, so during the COVID pandemic, we also defining another challenges faced by persons with disabilities that were to be considered in the development planning process. The first one is loss of livelihoods. In the first image, we can see the persons with visual impairment having difficulties in continuing their mass or enterprising because due to the limited physical and social distancing, they kind of like loss of livelihoods for like couple of months. And then the second one is the reduced educational opportunities, especially for children with disabilities with limited services to the internet connections from the parents. And also those persons with hearing impairment struggle to understand the learning process during these pandemic situations. And then the third one is the unequal access to government support. So because of the segregated data not available in the city, it creates unequal access for those having to get the governmental support during this pandemic. Okay, and then the fourth one is the limited social life and capacity to organize. It related to the disability organizations that they enjoy and then they participate in the daily life. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, they couldn't meet with each other, and then there is a limitations of their affordability to internet connections, and then also tools and equipment to enforce them to do these virtual connections or meetings. So that's why they have more limited social life compared to us. And then before the COVID, even like 45% of persons with disabilities in city of Banjarmasin, Indonesia, not having mobility in the city for such a long time. And then the fifth is the poor access to informations. So at the earlier stage of the pandemic situation, it creates some kind of like chaotic situation because there is no clear information regarding to how to do like a clean or hygiene their assistive tools, or like to make their life more following the health protocol. So this pandemic situation creates more challenges for the persons with disabilities, and then us who are working in the development sectors need to consider all of these aspects. And next slide, please. So in Kota Kita, as an urban planning and development specialist, we believe that participatory data collections has crucial meaning and implications in the inclusive development. So because we all need to know who will be engaged and benefited from the initiative, programs, and policies. So in 2017 and 2018, Kota Kita conducted participatory data collections to map the distributions of the persons with disabilities in 2 cities in Indonesia, including the city of Solo and Banjarmasin. And then this map demonstrated our mapping for the distributions of the persons with disabilities in the city of Banjarmasin. So it was actually like twice numbers from the Department of Social that have been documented in around like more than 1,600 blocks in the city. So this data, like we know, we not only producing this data for fine-grained informations about the disability conditions, but also to provide strategy for evidence-based planning and policymaking process. For example, our data has contributed to the improvement of persons with disabilities in Indonesian presidential elections in 2019. So it was crossed with the data from the election commissions, which is like 3rd times numbers of disabilities have been documented to be eligible to vote. And then the right image is showing our participations and then collaborations with the Department of Social Affairs in distributing the social aids for the persons with disabilities. So the 2 slides is like, I want to engage you all, like why inclusivity matters. Next slide, please. So in the inclusive approach, it creates spaces for vulnerable groups to voice their aspirations. It contributes to the empowerment of persons with disabilities as a subject, not an object. So it mobilizes their agency and skills. So if you see in the pictures, like all of these people are so excited to share their voices and thoughts and aspirations, even from the disabled, elderly, and then children's. Also really excited because it was the first time for them to enjoy this kind of dialogues. And the next slide is showing this image of the result, and then the finding that making all voices is really count for them, because at the first stage, we can see all the words, like thoughts that's written in the words is kind of like a bit hard for them. And then that's why, like Kota Kita and expertise, we are creating the innovation tools and methodologies also to accommodate like children aspirations in developing the more safe and inclusive schools for them. So we are doing craftings and also like taking photos to make them more, more visualizations, because sometimes they are not familiar with words. So we are emphasizing that more coordinated disability right movements and advocacy, which is like highlighting the data-driven, is really important to create a stronger, more solid advocacy works and capacity to engage in the policy dialogues. So the last words for me representing the Kota Kita is like it takes all of us to build a city for all. And that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that wonderfully inspiring message. Before I proceed, I have to correct my ignorance around the world clock. I understand you're actually joining us in the evening rather than the morning. So for those of you who are in Indonesia and were a little bit confused by my wishing you a good breakfast or whatever, please allow me to correct that misconception. Oh my goodness, there is so much that you both said. And to that end, it's great that we are recording this so that those who are here today will be able to revisit both of the presentations from Dr. Abs Doumbouya. Dr. Doumbouya, I beg you, put your camera. I'm going to encourage Dr. Doumbouya to to join us again for the question and answer part of today's proceedings. We don't have very much time, but just if I could pick up on a few of the points that you made. Nina, I really love the fact that you and Dr. Doumbouya both referred to climate change and the environment. You spoke about the fact that obviously if floods make access difficult, and if you have a physical disability, obviously that's going to make it even more difficult for you to reach wherever you need to get to be educated or go to work or earn any kind of income, let alone during this pandemic. And the other thing that you referred to was something that we've all experienced during COVID-19, which is the isolation caused by COVID-19 lockdown. And I hope that those of us here today who haven't experienced this before will be able to reflect more frequently and hopefully do something with those reflections about how disabled people live with magnified isolation even before the pandemic. A lot of people are socially isolated. Now we all know a bit more about how it feels. Let's hope we can translate that into positive action. Dr. Doumbouya, I love the example that you used about the need for consciousness raising. You use the example of finally lobbying for funds to include a ramp, only to have hawkers then block the ramp completely. So this all speaks to the fact that we need people to be educated about how their actions impact on others. We also need funding for things as basic as policing in order to ensure that roads and access avenues are kept clear for people with disabilities. As someone who grew up in Freetown, I'm very grateful to hear about the work that you've done to counteract all those what we call, double stories, so that people know of the value that people with disabilities bring to us. One thing, of course, that we have to touch on is what you both referred to, which is the need for policy change and the reasons why those policy changes don't happen is often because policy changes have an economic cost. And even as development practitioners, one of the things that we want to discuss today is how inclusive are we really? Are development practitioners willing to put our hands in our pockets when we go for funding and say, actually, we need to pay for sign language interpreters. We need to pay to make our buildings accessible. We need to pay for training for all of us in disability awareness. And we also need to consider those disabilities that aren't immediately obvious. There are a lot of people who live with what we call invisible disabilities. And I apologize if the use of that term is itself discriminatory, but you don't always know when you meet someone what issues they have in their life and what are we as development practitioners doing to be truly inclusive. So those are some of the issues that I hope will come up in the discussion. I will go to the chat now to see if there are any questions. I know that we had a point made by Eunice Nakebale in Uganda and a Rita Chowdhury please do come back and share with our speakers if you like. Miss Eunice, if you don't mind, can you please put on your microphone and camera if you would like to speak your point to the discussion today, or let me know whether you prefer us to read that out. So I'm going to try and multitask here, which I'm not always great with. So Eunice, if you're there and you're able to put your camera on and microphone on and join us to ask a question, please do. Right, so I'm not sure if you're still with us. So I will read out the comment that's in the chat that Eunice has put there, which is that children with visual and hearing impairments in Uganda were left behind in the distance learning during COVID-19. These children are supposed to return to school and compete with fellow learners who don't have a disability. This in itself continues to widen the inequalities in education as children with disabilities are left out. So if I could just put that point to you, Nina and Dr. Doumbouya, if you have any comments to make on that, please.
Over to you, Nina.
Okay, so yeah, I'm going to respond first. Thank you, Dr. Abies. So in our experience as children with disabilities in our schools interventions, because in the city of Banjarmasin, we provide and then collaborate with Department of Transportations and also GIZ from Germany to provide safe school zones. And then while they are not getting to schools, those children with disabilities are also provided like home visit from the teachers, so that they can get like educations directly from the teachers, or even like there is also like another support from the teachers. So once or twice a week they can visit the schools and then to get the homework and then to get assistance from the teachers, because it's sometimes hard for those children with disabilities and special needs. They need like an extra care and assistance from the teachers, and then it couldn't be provided through online virtual meetings, something like this. So they put like different kind of methods, and they are trying their best to provide these issues. But then there is also like another issues like in internet connections, because these parents who are mostly working in the informal sectors, having it hard to get like a job and like a salary and an income who can afford the internet connection. So this kind of methodology can be one of the alternatives that the schools can implement. It depends on the cities itself. But then in Indonesia, this Ministry of Education also provide the support for internet connections. So I think it will be like a helpful support for these children. Thank you. That's for me.
Thank you.
I think in Sierra Leone, there are two examples, and one of them is so odd, really, during COVID. I mean, I think the first one is that we worked on a project, a Dutch project, where we tried to provide radios to a lot of people with disabilities to listen to the radio teaching program that the Ministry of Basic and Senior Secondary Education provided, which they implemented pretty quickly, actually. But the other thing that happened, obviously, when COVID hit in Sierra Leone on I think it was the 31st of March, of course, schools were closed. And then as the cases peaked and they went down again, they were quick to open schools. The challenge then was for people with hearing impairment, because most of them were lip reading. And then you have the mandate that says everybody have to wear face masks. And so they found it very challenging to be able to lip read on what some of the teachers are saying. So I know a school in Makeni in the northern province of Sierra Leone. They found it very, very difficult to deal with these cases. Then suddenly there was this idea of sort of transparent face masks, which helped the situation. But yeah, I mean, COVID had a terrible impact on persons with disabilities. Like you said earlier, quite apart from the isolation. I mean, we did a quick implementation. I like what Nina talked about earlier. The situation with us is we have very poor data on disability in this country. So let alone to disaggregate the data. So what we wanted to do was to look at, first of all, keep a tally on how many people with disabilities that have been affected by COVID. And so today we're the only group that's doing that. And I can categorically say there's only been one case of somebody with a disability in Bonn, in the southern province, that got COVID and he recovered from it. Because when the whole cases started, there was a lot of issue about the impact that it might have on people with disabilities. And nobody was keeping track of that. I mean, people were keeping detailed track on the sex of people being contracting polio, the region, and all of these quite detailed stuff. And yet there was nothing on disability. So we started keeping a database based on the runs that the government was sending out, the run of data that was coming, the weekly stats that were coming out. So yeah, there's a lot of impact and across the board, across these areas that we've been talking about of developmental strides.
Thank you very much. We have a question that's been put in, sent directly in, and the person has asked me to ask this question on their behalf, which it is my pleasure to. And it is, I wonder if the speakers could address the intersectionality between disability and sexuality, specifically in relation to queer communities within their respective countries, Indonesia and Sierra Leone. So there is
that Korea?
Sorry? Queer.
Yeah.
So the word she's used is queer, as in gay.
Okay. That's a tough question. I think perhaps my response, we have what we call night husbands. That's a I think we're doing a lot of research on, quite apart from the sexuality of, the queer word that he was using. But we have what we call night husbands. And what this is men that go at night to sleep with these disabled women, and then they disappear during the day. So that means they don't want to be linked to somebody with disability because they think they'll be provoked to say, you're keeping somebody, you're in love with somebody who's a disabled woman. And so they're ashamed of that. And so I think just taking an extension of that to this particular question, I think the society is pretty harsh on intersexual people with, in the disability realm, if I can put it that way. So we have these odd things that are going on. We're still not buying into bisexual and all of that. So I think it's a very, very difficult thing within the disabled community. I'm not aware, and I've been in Sierra Leone back now for over 11 years, and even growing up here, I don't think I've ever come across a group or person who is bisexual or homosexual.
So are there any other comments in response to that question? I mean, I would say myself that just because we haven't met people doesn't mean they don't exist.
Of course, yes.
So, I think we all acknowledge that. I have a couple more questions in the chat that I would like to come to if we have time later. But first of all, I would like to go to Sharon Lupton, so Sharon, if you're still with us, would you like to unmute yourself, put your camera on and ask your question?
Hello there. My name's Sharon Lupton. I'm the Programme Manager for the Safeguarding Leeds Network. And so naturally, I'm interested to hear about inclusive approaches to safeguarding against sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment. And that's obviously specifically to disabled people.
Fantastic. Thank you.
I think I'll start by rephrasing again what I said earlier about night husbands. I mean, this is clearly a form of exploitation of women with disabilities, where you have these guys, they go at night, and because we have these organizations of persons with disability grouped in different parts of the city and different parts of the country, and so you have the able men going into these organizations, falling in love with these disabled women, but they don't want society to know that they have a disabled girlfriend, and so but they go there and exploit them sexually, and then when these girls get pregnant and they give birth, these guys are nowhere to be seen, and so there are many cases. I know the Ministry of Social Welfare here is fighting very hard to deal with those cases of exploitations. But I think there's also another form of exploitation where, it's between disabled men and disabled women, and that they think that, these are our sisters, quote unquote, and we can do what we want. And they treat her just like our sisters. And again, these are very serious cases that have been looked at specifically how to resolve and get to the point and give the women their rights. And I think there are women groups that are standing up now in fighting some of these exploitations in Sierra Leone. Sadly, though, especially the non-disabled women's group, there's still a lack of including people with disabilities or making sure their voices are heard in these bigger, wider women's group in Sierra Leone.
Thank you very much. Any other comments, or shall I move to the last two questions? Okay, I will move to the last two questions that we've had posted, both unfortunately by people who have had to leave, but who will be accessing the presentation's recording. So the first one was from Ritu Chowdhury, who asked about autism and whether autism is a condition that's curable. And the second question was from John Gibbs. I just need to find it again, but I think actually while I'm looking for it to make sure, here it is. So my question is, what part the national authorities play to overcome the barriers, and to whom are they accountable? So yeah, those are the last two questions. The first one about autism and the second about government accountability, and then we'll move to closing. So if either Nina or Dr. Abs, Nina, if you're able to come in on any of those two questions, that would be great. And of course, Dr. Abs, we know you're still unmuted, so please do go ahead, either of you.
Thank you, Sharon. So from what I know, is like sorry.
I think that was just some interference from the audience. I think someone temporarily unmuted.
So I will be sharing my experiences in the Autism Matters, because we are also in contact with some of the participants who having the children with autism. They usually like a therapist from earlier day, and then like it related to their cognitives and then all other skills. So they kind of doing the therapist since earlier recognition. So it helps them to get better when the age is older. And then I'm going to answer the second question. It's about the relations of the government. So in Indonesia, it's a bit hard to intervene with the national policy itself and the national government, because, like in different cities, they have like a different context and different interventions, but the same general issues is about the data. So actually, like the first thing that we need to do is about the data, the documentations of the persons with disabilities. And then Kotekita's experiences, usually we are working closely with the Department of Socials and then Department of Education to get the data for children with special needs. You know, like we can doing all these collaborations with them since the very beginning of the interventions, and then after we are doing the mapping, we can collaborate more with another department in the city. So I think like the city government having like very crucial interventions and then crucial positions in determining all the policies and then programs that can be done to benefiting these people. And then, you know, like usually in Indonesia, after the cities get recognized for being inclusive by doing the progressive efforts and then programs towards inclusivity, they will be recognized by the national level government. And that's the moment that we can intervene with the replications and then adaptations of the interventions and then programs. And then the replicability of the programs can be leveraging to other cities in the country. So I think the most important one is, you know, like from the bottom up solution. So we need to approach the city government, and then Indonesia is also having like a provincial government. And after that, we can get through the national government. And thank you. That's from me.
Bottom-up approach. Thank you very much. Dr. Doumbia, do you have any comments on the last two questions before we move to closing?
Yes, I mean, I think the one on autism, I have no much technical knowledge on autism, but we have been doing programs on autism with children exhibiting, you know, epilepsy and the level of autism. And I know for sure that there isn't a particular cure. I mean, that you can look at the symptoms and the outcomes of them exhibiting autism. Like most of them that have epilepsy will be given epileptic drugs to help their seizures. And so there isn't, I think, the specific answer to the question. I'm not aware that there is a particular cure per se for autism. Of course, you have different levels of in the spectrum of autism. The second part of the question about government or national government involvement in removing barriers, as well as their accountability. I think in Sierra Leone, as I said, we have the central government, which has established the National Commission for Persons with Disabilities, and their mandate is to look at disability issues in terms of policies, but also to support specific disability groups. When I say specific, that's wrong, actually. They're supposed to support all disabled groups here. But there's also, so that's been supervised with the Ministry of Social Welfare. Together, you have the National Union on Disability, which is called the Sierra Leone Union on Disability Issues. And they focus mainly on the DPOs, the disabled people organizations. In terms of what the intervention, I think most of the intervention of this particular government that we have has been captured in the midterm development plan that's been implemented by the Ministry of Planning and Economic Development. So, and one of the things they do, specifically for my area of knowledge and expertise, is in the Ministry of Education and Inclusive Education. And I think that's led mainly to the development of the inclusive education policy, which has never existed before. It was started by an NGO, the Sight Savers, through our Educating Children with Disability Network. And that's because only government that have to table bills and all of that in the House of Parliament, NGOs don't do that. So everything has to be channeled through the Ministry of Education. And they've added to that what they call radical inclusion. So since the 2004 Education Act was passed, there was nothing substantive in the Act on Disability, but this inclusive education policy is going to give a lot of opportunities to people with disabilities to participate in education and getting rid of discrimination and all of those aspects. In terms of accountability, obviously, central government is accountable to people with disabilities, and we have a very vibrant advocacy groups in Sierra Leone, which holds government to account a lot. And it's very, very important that we make government aware that our needs are not being met and that we are not participating equitably in decision making and others. So I think there's a lot of work that we're doing in terms of making sure that Sierra Leone and people with disabilities in Sierra Leone have their voices heard.
Thank you. And that's obviously something that we in the development sphere need to be replicating also, to make sure that these issues remain high up on the development agenda. So we're pretty much out of time. It only remains for me to thank everybody who's attended today, particularly our wonderful interpreters. I have to say, it looks physically exhausting, the job that you are doing. So we're very grateful that you've been able to do this for us. Thank you, Nina, for joining us at night. Dr. Doumbouya, thank you for joining us, Phantom. And please, can I encourage you all to have a look at our website for our next event on 11th March, where we will be joined by Dr. Sevasti Fokker, who is making available a manual that she has produced that will help to develop resilience in children who have coped with the trauma of displacement, which was developed as a result of the extensive work that she has done as a volunteer in refugee camps. Please do link up with us on Twitter. We're also on Facebook and LinkedIn. Please do check out the work that Dr. Doumbouya's Dorothy Springer Trust is doing in Sierra Leone and that Kota Kita is doing in Indonesia. Stay in touch with us, look after yourselves. Let's keep this fight going onwards and upwards. And thank you very much. We will post this webinar as soon as we can on our social media feeds. Thank you for joining us today and take good care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.